In this first video, I'm going to tackle one of the most popular theories concerning an antichrist. I don't even use the word antichrist in my website anymore because people will automatically connect it to what they believe about the antichrist, and I don't agree with any of that. I don't believe that particular person is ever going to appear. Could be wrong, but I don't think I am in this case, because I don't feel that the scripture supports this coming antichrist, that type of antichrist. This theory came about around 150 years ago. It's about a charismatic man who will broker a 7-year peace agreement with Israel, let them rebuild the temple and begin the sacrificing, and in the midst of the week he will put an end to those sacrifices and try to take over the world. Everybody will think he's great, then he suddenly turns evil. I personally learned of this in the 70s with the book by Hal Lindsey, The Great Lake Planet Earth. It took a lot of years for the Lord to get that thinking out of my head. And everything that he tried to show me with his scripture, I would try to fit into that 7 years and that particular Antichrist. So I want to start with the Olivet Discourse that speaks about this abomination of desolation that will be standing in the holy place, or standing where he ought not. These three accounts, or there are three accounts, and they can be found in Matthew 24, Mark 12 and 13, and Luke 21. Back in 1995, approximately, the Lord made me think that I should take my Bible over to the copy machine across the street, make a copy of these three accounts, cut them out and lay them side by side, and with colored pencils mark those things that were the same in all three accounts. Online I've kind of done it like this, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the biggest thing is that I heard online a lot was people believe that Luke was telling about a different discourse that Jesus gave on a different day, either before this or after this, and that he was speaking about the destruction in 70 AD, but yet Matthew and Mark were talking about a future Antichrist. I don't find that to be true. When I put these all together, you can see how much they are alike. The discourse begins with Jesus and some of the apostles in the temple and in the women's section, and they're watching an old widow woman putting her last 2 mites in the treasury, a little horn. They then leave the temple. Now this account can be found in, this part of it can be found in Mark and in Luke, but not in Matthew. So Mark and Luke are talking about the same day. This is the day the old woman did this, and Jesus taught about it. They then left the temple, and they're going over to the Mount of Olives, to their camp, and probably about halfway up, when you can see the temple again, some of the apostles begin to comment on these buildings. And it says in Matthew, Jesus came out of the temple, it was going away, when his disciples came up to him to point out the temple buildings. Mark says he was going out of the temple, and one of the disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Luke says, "And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, So they're talking about Herod's temple, not some temple in the future. And this becomes very important in our understanding. Jesus says in Matthew, "Do you not see these things?" In Mark he says, "Do you see these great buildings?" He goes on to say, "Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." This was the case in 70 AD. The temple itself was torn down because it had gold leaf all on the inside. And when they lit it on fire, the gold melted down in between the stones, and they had to remove every single stone to get that gold. Now they are asking him later, when they get up to the camp, 3 of the apostles get him alone and begin to ask him, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" This is actually 2 different questions, although they, I'm sure, thought it was one, because they expected all this to take place in their lifetimes. But for us, it's 2 different questions. There's a span of about almost 2,000 years in there. Jesus then begins to tell them of certain things that are going to take place, and he begins with those things that are going to happen in our time, end time events. But then at the end of telling those, Luke again translates and says, "But before these things, these other things are going to take place." The things that will take place is that they will be hated because of Jesus' names. He's talking to the apostles, but not to worry about what they would say. Let's see, what else had happened? The great apostasy would take place. We hear about this apostasy, that it's going to happen in our time, but it actually happened back then. People that were kicked out of their homes, their families, their synagogues, and these were believers in Jesus that I would say the seed was not planted deep enough in them, and so they began to fall away from his teachings and return to the synagogue. The last thing that would happen, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice, is that the gospel would be preached to the nations. The word in Hebrew means nations or Gentiles, and Paul brought the gospel to the nations. So those are all going to be completed, and according to Jesus, and they were. And the next thing expected was, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," Mark says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be." Luke says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand," or near. They're told to flee, and to flee so quickly that you don't even go down to get your coat, let alone pack anything. You've got to get out quick. The reason that Luke does this, I believe, is because he's speaking to the Gentiles that may be in the city at that time. They're not going to know what's going on in the temple, not be aware that abomination of desolation is now standing there, but they're certainly going to see that army beginning to surround Jerusalem. The early church in Jerusalem did get out in time and went across the Jordan into an area probably around Pella. So you might be wondering, what was the abomination that stood in the temple in 70 AD? Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian that was there at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. he writes about it, and we refer to his book called The War of the Jews, book number 4, starting around chapter 4. The rebels that called themselves zealots back in that time had begun to rebel against Rome, and were going around from city to city murdering and causing fires and a lot of trouble. And they had made their way to Jerusalem and managed to get into Jerusalem, and they proceeded to capture the most powerful men in Jerusalem at the time, and put them in prison, and then they proceeded to murder them. And their point was to take over the city, take over the government. They managed to capture the Temple Mount, expel all of the priests and high priest, and then they were in the high position, because the temple was not just a temple house, but it was a fortress. According to Josephus, they trampled the sanctuary. They set up their camp there. They ate there, drank there, but polluted it. This was enough to say that it was an abomination in the holy place. But they went a step further. They wanted to control the government. So they convinced the people that there was an old law that they could use that said that they could cast lots for a new high priest, that the priest did not have to be of the priestly family line. The people were so far away from the law at that time that they actually accepted this lie. And so lots were casted for a simple man living out in the village, and he was brought in, and they put the priestly robes on him and taught him what to do, paraded him around. And believe it or not, this is putting oneself above all that God calls holy. If you put yourself above what God calls holy, His law, then you are making yourself as if you were God's. So that would be the abomination that was there, and it brought around the end of Jerusalem. Welcome to the Norma Seder Project. In this video, I'm discussing end times prophecies and what is fulfilled in the past and what still remains in the future. In the first video, I said that Jesus began the discourse by telling of things that would take place toward the end of the age, the birth pangs or beginning of sorrows, which refers to the earth, like the earth in labor about to give birth to the new age. So let's look at that verse. Matthew 24:5. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are the beginnings of birth pangs. Now Luke could have just called them birth pangs also, but since he was writing to Gentile Christians that may not have understood that saying, he simply says, but before these things, meaning that the birth pangs would be some of the last events to take place. And then he went on to tell of the things that would happen before the birth pangs. So how are we going to know where to fit the birth-pang events back into the timeline that Jesus was giving in the Discourse. I want to discuss that, but first I want to continue with where we left off in the first video. The people of Jerusalem were being told to flee before the city is destroyed. Next, Jesus begins to tell about the Great Tribulation in Matthew verse 21. Mark calls it a time of tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Luke makes it a little clearer, saying in 21:22, because these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. For there will be great distress upon this land, and a wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. He goes on to say, unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom God chose, he shortened those days. So, the Great Tribulation would concern the land of Jerusalem and those people trapped inside her walls when the destruction came upon the city. And now I'm sure that during the end days, when the last empire is persecuting the Jews and the Christians, we'll also think of that as a great tribulation. But these verses in the Discourse are talking specifically about what took place in 70 AD. When it says, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled, I think that that is showing a very long span of time between 70 AD and our time. And Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city, and it was trampled underfoot by the Gentiles for the next 1897 years. It wouldn't be until 1967 that the Jews recaptured or captured the city of Jerusalem from Islam, that Jewish rule and the law of God came back into that city, ending, I believe, the time of the Gentiles in Jerusalem. So now we get back to the birth pangs. The next event is where Jesus once again begins telling about false Christs, and says in verse 24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you this before. Now that's our clue there. He had told them about this before. It was when he began the Discourse in Matthew 24:5 through 8, starting with false Christs, followed by the birth pangs that will take place as it nears the end of the age. So Jesus continues, wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chamber, believe it not. For as lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Excuse me. We can compare the birth pangs to the seals in the book of Revelations to confirm that this is the order of the events. The first seal was opened, Revelation 6:2. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. The second seal is opened, and another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men should slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. These are both speaking about wars, as does the birth pangs. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says in Matthew 24:6, "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you not be troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." In the fourth seal, I looked, and behold, as an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following after him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, which means war, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the beasts of the earth. In Matthew 24, in the Olivet Discourse, that is where it says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famine and pestilence, and earthquakes in diverse places." And I looked, and he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of its place. In Matthew 24:29, in the Discourse, it says, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days," and I think it's talking about the tribulation of the birth pains, "the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken." We can see that this is the same event taking place here. And what happens next? Matthew 24:30, "And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with great power and glory, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." So we can see that in his discourse, Jesus tells us not only what would be happening to Herod's temple in 70 AD, but he also told us what will happen at the end of the age in both the Discourse and in the seals in the book of Revelation, and they're the same. I have found that the book of Revelation isn't telling us a whole lot of new things. It's just giving more detail to all of Jesus' prophecies during his ministry, and more detail of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the end of the age. And I know it's kind of tough to look at these things in a whole new light, but once I saw the order in these verses, I had no choice but to change my thinking, and I hope I've helped you look at things in a new light. For me, God keeps pulling the rug out from under me, and it doesn't feel good. Okay. Only in hindsight can we see the gap in time between the destruction of Jerusalem and when Jesus will actually return, hopefully in our lifetime. The apostles, however, expected him to return in their lifetime. And God, in his infinite wisdom, let them believe that. I think God has wanted every generation since then to believe that Jesus is going to return in their lifetime. 1 John 2:18 says, "Children, it is the last hour, and just as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. The last hour simply means the final years before the return of Christ and the end of the age. Paul tells the people in 1 Corinthians 15:52, "Lo, I tell you a mystery. We shall not sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed." We can now apply this to us as being among those that won't die, some of us, but we'll be changed in the twinkling of an eye. But they were the we listening to Paul at that time, or reading his letters to them. He is saying not all of them will die, because he believed the end of the age would be in their lifetime. Let's see, Mark 13:32, "But of that day or that hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." So even Jesus, when giving the discourse, did not know when he would be returning.